Call the member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, in calling for a commission of inquiry into the pink bat scheme, I support the opposition environment spokesperson who has moved this motion today. And while I do welcome the words of the government, and particularly acknowledging some of the tragedies that were inherent in this program, I think it's a shame with a motion today that involves such heart that the government cannot speak from it today, but instead reads a carefully prepared statement that varies not a syllable from what appears on paper and has almost certainly been provided by the Minister's office. And I think that's a great shame in this place that there cannot be some free discussion in the chamber. The inquiry, of course, performed by the Auditor-General showed us that there was just a hint there of some of the great fiscal and policy-making disasters, but has gone nowhere near far enough in unravelling where the cause was of many of these problems. There are 1.1 million Australian dwellings that have now been insulated, and my previous speaker pointed out that the 17 million tonnes of carbon abated must represent surely in excess of $140 a tonne of carbon abated, an absolutely completely crazy investment if it was purely environmental. And if we want to look at the stimulus effect, which I will focus on today, it was just as irresponsible policy making. So my role here today for the first half of the speech will be to look at the context in which this home insulation package evolved from the then-elected Rudd-Gillard government. What drove this government to be so stubborn that it ignored every warning throughout 2009. I will then move through some of the more collateral damage that has often been ignored by the Labor government, and that further underlines why we do need this inquiry for Australians the length and breadth of this nation, many of whom suffered enormously as a result of the government's actions. Now, of course, back in 2007, with the newly elected Labor government, optimism was high. There was a massive surplus on the table, and this Biafran and starved administration looked forward to spending the lot. And they got the tick of approval at G20 meetings, and a small man came back from large meetings, Deputy Speaker, intent on spending every cent. Had the support of finance ministers who were genuinely worried about where the GFC could take Australia. And Treasury obliged, performing TRIM modelling, which in the 09-10 budget indicated a massive drop to Australia's real GDP if we did nothing. And history will not remember that a government saved us from the GFC. History, when all nations have negotiated the GFC, will remember who did it most efficiently and most effectively, and who did it wastefully. And in 2009, of course, in the budget, there was predicted by TRIM modelling a 4.5-point GDP collapse in Australia's real GDP, based on US inputs predominantly. Now, what's important is not the pilot who loses control of his instruments, but the pilot who fails to heed them once those instruments work again. And within MyEFO, within a few months post-09 budget, MyEFO in August made it inherently clear that this fiscal slowing, or the fiscal gap, was only about 40% of what had been predicted months earlier. Now, the coalition joined with this government and supported Stimulus 1 without significant question, but it was Stimulus 2 in the face of evolving evidence coming from overseas that Australia in March-April had hit bottom and was stabilising, but the Rudd-Gillard government ploughed on, ignoring the evidence and all that has rolled in since that a more cautious and responsible stimulus would have done the trick. So they were left with a $2.4 or $2-point-something billion home insulation package, and they were intent on spending every cent of it, regardless of the warnings. And that's where it first went wrong. And we had DEWA, a department not usually in the position of rolling out social packages, being responsible for a multi-billion-dollar program like few Commonwealth entities are. And they provided the government with recurrent advice that this program needed to be rolled out over 5 years, not with pedal to the metal, but over 5 years to ensure that 1, training and resources were adequate, that 2, the backlog of other programs was taken care of, 3, that staff accommodation was adequate, and 4, that the IT systems could manage the massive movement of money. And when an Auditor-General's report fails to find that the minister had any responsibility for this very program, when the architects of it were the Rudd-Gillard administration, it is utterly clear that we need to look at this one more time, and this time see how many more warnings and when the then Environment Minister received on his desk. As we passed through 2009, the evidence appeared in electorates around the country, and I asked the Banana Republic question when I could see installers coming to me saying the insulation bat packages that were $19 a bag are now $32 and rising. It was clear that the stimulus package was being gouged by wholesalers along the supply chain who provided the bats to Australia. So the great stimulus package was actually helping businesses that had no need to be helped. This was a completely overheated subsector of the Australian economy, and we had a government that could not see it. So with the inflation rate we calculated in mid-2009 of 317%, Deputy Speaker, a little bit outside of the RBA target range there, 317% inflation, no wonder everyone was in it up to their elbows. And was there any training units? Was there any supervision? Was there any provision of safety advice from this government? I don't expect the federal minister to deliver the safety training, but I expect a federal minister with the wit to realise that if thousands of young, untrained people move into ceilings around this country and start fiddling around with electrical wires and using stapling guns, something needs to be done. And now, hidden as best they could, out come the warnings that were there all the time from state agencies, federal agencies, the unions, and most importantly, those who have been delivering insulation for decades. And this place owes an apology, not just to insulators, but in particular across northern Australia, the tropical and subtropical parts of this great country where foil insulation is most used because it has a slight advantage by not trapping hot air in the insulate. Foil was very popular in northern Australia, and small companies had done a great job for decades installing this foil safely. And they watched on as fly-by-nighters came in, drawn, lured in by the offer of thousands of dollars, hiring school kids to carry the stuff up into ceilings. It was an abomination. And people expect just one thing of their government. It's too much to expect them to be effective. It's too much to expect this lot to be efficient. But we just hope that this administration would protect people. That's all that they could ask for, and it's all families wanted. All we can ask of a government is, first, if you take money from one and give to another, just make sure you don't leave it in an abomination and leave people damaged, leave careers destroyed. But it's not limited to home insulation. No, this is not an isolated problem. This was a problem that, as I will show, runs right across the green sector. And to those young people who put their studies on hold, for people who gave up their small business and entered green loans training, only to have their training and registration and indemnity fees completely lost as they never had a chance to enter the green economy, this place should be saying sorry. And for the people that are sitting at home, had a knock on the door, one of the lucky 10% had their homes inspected, told the insulation was unsafe and told, have it removed or we want you to indemnify us. And then when the insulation is removed, no offer of replacement. For those young single mums living in tropical accommodation, the first chance in their life to have some insulation, then have it taken out with no replacement because that's not part of the program, is an absolute disgrace for those low-income earning families in my electorate who were given that Hobson's choice of have it ripped out and not replaced or sign your life away and that of your kids. That was appalling treatment. And to think there's 90% of households that have never been looked at. We are right to ask, what are the odds of faulty, ineffective, dangerous or flawed installation, 30% or 25 or 20, let's see the numbers. But this patronising administration says you're not worthy of knowing the numbers because you might panic. You might not be able to take the truth. Imagine if a police force refused to give results of data like that because you might not be able to take the truth. That's the job of a government, to be transparent and honest. Look, we don't pretend that this was ever going to be a wonderful environmental program, but there was hope there it could abate some carbon. But 2-point-something billion disappeared into nowhere and did damage, not just to those immediately, but to the many who bought up stock and filled storerooms with insulation, trusting that a government wouldn't let them down. And don't ever forget this lot who told you that vulnerable employees were being fired by SMS through the Work Choices Exchange, because this lot fired all of them by SMS. They were up in the ceiling putting the foil out and they got an SMS, you're fired, the program's over, bad luck for any insulation you've still got in your possession.
And that was appalling.
And that was appalling to treat employees that way, having only just a few years before blamed small business for doing the same thing. We expect better of a government. and an inquiry is the right way to get to the bottom of it. This minister still skates along without having been brought to justice, and there are many elements of the way these warnings from ordinary Australians were ignored that need to be revealed.